There was no church. No eulogies. No long line of black limousines crawling down a Los Angeles boulevard. No cameras. No flowers placed on a mahogany casket by trembling hands. When the king of late night died, he left this world the way he always lived in it, completely on his own terms, and completely alone. But here is the thing about a man who spends 30 years in front of millions of people. You can control your exit. You can refuse a funeral. You can ask for no memorial. But you cannot control your story. And in the days following Johnny Carson's death on January 23, 2005, one name rose above all others. Not Jay Leno. Not David Letterman. Not Ed McMahon. It was the name of a woman he hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 decades. A woman he had built up, championed, and then, with one silent click of a telephone, destroyed. And she became the most unexpected, most haunting presence at a funeral that never happened. Who was she? And why, even in death, could Johnny Carson not escape her? To understand why this story matters, you first have to understand who Johnny Carson really was. Not the polished, charming man behind the Tonight Show desk. The real Johnny Carson. Those closest to him described someone almost impossible to know. His longtime sidekick Ed McMahon spent 30 years sitting just a few feet away from him every single night, and once admitted that he was never entirely sure they were actually friends. Carson's biographer Henry Bushkin, who served as his personal attorney for nearly 2 decades, later wrote a memoir that painted a portrait of a deeply lonely, emotionally remote man, someone who used humor as armor and fame as a wall between himself and the rest of the world. Dick Cavett, one of the few people in television who could genuinely be called Carson's peer, recalled how visibly uncomfortable Johnny became the moment the cameras stopped rolling. In a room full of strangers, the man who had made 50 million people feel like they were being let in on a private joke would shut down entirely. He would strain to make small talk. He would retreat inward. The spotlight was not just his job. It was the only place he felt safe. And then there were the grudges. Johnny Carson carried them like a second skin. Those who crossed him, and many did, discovered quickly that there was no appealing the sentence. The ban was total. The silence was permanent. In Hollywood, where relationships are currency, Carson's anger was a kind of financial ruin. It was into this world, the court of the king, that a struggling Brooklyn-born comedian stumbled on the night of February 17, 1965. Joan Rivers had been at it for nearly a decade by then. Comedy clubs in Greenwich Village. Temp jobs. A first marriage that had already collapsed. She had auditioned for The Tonight Show 7 times and been turned down 7 times. By 1965, she was 31 years old, and people in the industry were quietly saying she had missed her window. The February booking wasn't even really a vote of confidence. It was a favor, arranged because her manager also represented Bill Cosby. A mercy slot. A last shot. She walked out onto that stage and something happened that she would spend the rest of her life trying to explain. The audience connected with her instantly. The timing was perfect. The material was sharp. And the man behind the desk, the unflappable, cool, legendary Johnny Carson, started genuinely laughing. Not the polite television laugh. The real one. When her set ended and she sat down on the coveted couch beside him, Carson leaned over and said something that no comedian ever forgets. On national television, in front of millions of viewers, he looked at Joan Rivers and said, "You're going to be a star." She later said she actually looked behind her, convinced he must be talking to someone else. From that single sentence, a career was born. Rivers went on to make nearly 100 appearances on The Tonight Show over the next 20 years. She became Carson's permanent guest host in 1983. When Johnny needed a night off, Joan was the one who sat in his chair. When she launched her short-lived daytime show in 1968, he showed up as her very first celebrity guest, a massive, public signal of his belief in her. In an industry built on ego and competition, that kind of generosity was almost unheard of. She would say for years afterward, "He handed me my career." But beneath the warmth of those studio lights, something important was always missing. Rivers herself acknowledged it openly. Their relationship, she wrote, existed almost entirely on camera. During commercial breaks, when the red light went off and the audience murmur dropped to silence, they often had nothing to say to each other. Carson's legendary aloofness created an invisible line. He was the king. She was the jester he had elevated. And there was always, underneath the laughter, a hierarchy. By the mid-1980s, Rivers began to feel that hierarchy shifting, and not in her favor. In 1985, Carson signed a new contract with NBC. Rivers was offered only a 1-year deal. Then came the news that rattled her most. NBC had quietly circulated a list of potential replacements for Carson, comedians who could one day inherit The Tonight Show. Joan Rivers, who had logged more hours in that host chair than any person alive besides Carson himself, was not on it. Not even as an afterthought. She later drew one painful conclusion from that: NBC would never give the job to a woman. Her years as guest host had been a showcase, not a ladder. It was at this exact moment of vulnerability that Fox came knocking. The fledgling network was preparing to launch, and its executives, including the formidable Barry Diller, wanted something explosive to announce their arrival. They offered Rivers her own late-night program, The Late Show starring Joan Rivers. The salary was reported to be around $10 million. The time slot. Directly opposite The Tonight Show. Rivers faced an agonizing decision. Her husband and manager, Edgar Rosenberg, gave her one critical piece of advice: do not tell Carson until the contract is signed. The logic was cold but rational. Other comedians who had left for competing shows were routinely banned from The Tonight Show. If she told Johnny early and the Fox deal fell apart, she could end up with nothing. Worse, Carson was powerful enough to make a single phone call and kill the deal before it ever happened. So she stayed silent. And the news leaked anyway. What happened next is one of the most disputed stories in the history of American television, and the truth of it may have died with both of them. According to Rivers, she was horrified when Carson heard the news from someone else. She immediately tried to reach him. She says she finally got through, began to explain herself, and heard only silence on the other end of the line. Then a click. She called back. He hung up again. That was the last time they ever spoke. Carson's version was entirely different. He told people the phone call never happened. He said he learned about The Late Show starring Joan Rivers the same way the rest of the world did, from a press release. He felt ambushed, blindsided, betrayed. Rivers had her own theory about why his reaction was so extreme, a theory that cut far deeper than professional rivalry. She believed Carson felt, on some level, that because she was a woman, she was his. That she wouldn't leave. That the rules of Hollywood ambition applied to everyone except the woman he had discovered. When she defied that assumption, it wasn't competition. In his mind, it was treason. The punishment was immediate and total. Rivers was permanently banned from The Tonight Show. Any celebrity who appeared on her Fox program was told they would no longer be welcome on Carson's. The Late Show struggled to book anyone. Ratings collapsed. Less than 9 months after it launched, Fox fired them both. Professional humiliation is survivable. Hollywood has seen it 1,000 times. Careers collapse and rebuild. Feuds cool. Time passes. What happened next went beyond professional. 3 months after Fox fired them, Edgar Rosenberg, Rivers' husband, manager, and the person who had guided every step of the decision, took his own life. The strain of the failure, the debt, and the very public downfall had become unbearable for him. Joan Rivers was left completely alone. Her career was in ruins. Her husband was gone. And from the man who had once been her greatest champion, the man who had told her on national television that she would be a star, there was nothing. No phone call. No note. No single word of condolence. She would later describe this silence as the thing she could never forgive. Not the Fox ban. Not the blacklist. The silence after Edgar died. You could rationalize professional anger. But to say nothing to a woman who had worked beside you for 20 years, in the worst moment of her life, that revealed a side of Carson that his audience never got to see. Rivers survived. She rebuilt, slowly, painfully, defiantly. A daytime talk show that won her an Emmy. A second career as a red carpet commentator on E! Stand-up tours. Books. A reality show with her daughter Melissa. She became, improbably, one of the most resilient figures in American comedy. But the Carson wound never fully closed. Johnny Carson died on January 23, 2005. His body was cremated. There was no memorial service. The man who had commanded an audience of 50 million people for his final Tonight Show broadcast departed without a single public ceremony. The tributes poured in from every corner of American life. But almost immediately, in nearly every tribute, in nearly every remembrance, one name kept surfacing. Not the presidents he had outlasted. Not the celebrities who had sat on his couch. The name of a woman he had refused to speak to for 19 years. Rivers' reaction to his death was raw, contradictory, and entirely human. She called him a mean son of a bitch. And in the very same breath, She said he was the most brilliant straight man who ever lived and that nobody would ever touch him. The pain was as fresh as if the phone had been hung up yesterday. Rivers once described exactly how she imagined their story should have ended. After everything, the Fox show, the firing, Edgar's death, Carson should have called her back onto The Tonight Show and simply said, "Where have you been?" It would have been on every front page in America. It would have been one of the great moments in television history. It never happened. Jay Leno never had Rivers on during his entire 20-year run. The Tonight Show door stayed closed for 26 years. It finally opened on February 17, 2014, exactly 49 years to the day after Rivers had first walked onto that stage. Jimmy Fallon had just taken over as host. She arrived with a line she had clearly been saving for years, telling the audience she had been sitting in a taxi outside NBC with the meter running since 1987. 6 months later, Joan Rivers was dead. She passed away on September 4, 2014, following complications from a routine medical procedure. She was 81 years old. At her funeral at Temple Emmanuel in New York, Howard Stern delivered one of the most memorable eulogies, voice thick with grief, saying he could imagine her chasing Johnny Carson around heaven with a baseball bat. The crowd laughed. And then a lot of them cried. There was no funeral for Johnny Carson. But there was a ghost. Joan Rivers was the one person whose story could not be contained by his silence, the one loose thread in the life of a man who prided himself on absolute control. While he retreated into private retirement after 1992, never giving interviews, never commenting publicly, she was out in the world every day carrying the wound he had given her and refused to heal. She became, without meaning to, the keeper of his most complicated chapter. In the end, two things are true at the same time. Johnny Carson was one of the greatest entertainers America ever produced. And he was also a man who, when the woman he had made sat alone in the ruins of everything she had built, chose silence. He got the quiet exit he always wanted. But that silence was not empty. It was filled, as it had been for 19 years, with the voice of the one person he could never quite let go of and could never bring himself to forgive. The most unexpected guest at the end of his life was never standing in a room. She was the memory of a single sentence spoken on a February night in 1965. A promise that lasted 20 years. A phone call that lasted less than 10 seconds. And a silence that lasted the rest of both their lives.